The story of Franz Kafka begins with a betrayal. It is 1924, a sanatorium outside Vienna. Franz Kafka is 40 years old, dying of tuberculosis. He cannot speak because the disease has closed his throat. He is scribbling notes on scraps of paper to communicate. In his final moments, he hands a stack of papers to his best friend, Max Brod. These papers contain the manuscripts for the trial, the castle, and America. They are the masterpieces of the 20th century. But Kafka doesn't want them published. He looks at Max with feverish eyes and writes his last will and testament. "Dearest Max, my last request. Everything I leave behind me, in the way of diaries, manuscripts, letters, sketches, and so on, is to be burned unread." He wanted to be erased. He wanted to vanish from history like smoke. Max Brod nodded. He took the papers. And then he did the one thing Kafka asked him not to do. He refused to strike the match. If Max Brod had listened to his dying friend, the word Kafkaesque would not exist. We would not know Gregor Samsa. We would not know the horror of the bureaucracy. Max Brod betrayed his friend, but he saved literature. But why did Kafka hate himself so much? Why did he view his own genius as trash worthy of the fire? To understand the self-hatred of Franz Kafka, we have to meet the giant who cast a shadow over his entire life, his father. Hermann Kafka was a force of nature. He was a butcher's son who pulled himself up from poverty to become a successful retailer in Prague. He was massive, loud, aggressive, and domineering. He was a man of the body obsessed with meat, health, and shouting. Act. Franz was the opposite. He was frail, skinny, sensitive, and intellectual. He was a vegetarian in a house of meat-eaters. He was a whisper in a house of screams. The psychological torture began early. There is a famous story Kafka tells in his letter to his father. It's a 47-page letter he wrote at age 36, but never had the courage to send. One night, when Franz was a very small boy, he was whining for water in the middle of the night. Not because he was thirsty, but because he wanted attention. After a few warnings, his father stormed into the room. It didn't hit the boy. Instead, he grabbed him, carried him to the balcony of the Pavlich, and locked him outside in his nightshirt. It was pitch black. It was terrifying. The boy stood there for what felt like hours, pounding on the glass, realizing that he was nothing. He was an insect that could be crushed or discarded by the giant. Kafka later wrote, "Even years later I suffered from the tormenting fancy that the huge man, my father, the ultimate authority, would come almost for no reason at all and take me out of my bed in the night, and carry me out onto the Pavlich, and that meant I was a mere nothing for him." This moment broke him. It taught him that authority is arbitrary, cruel, and impossible to understand. It taught him that he was guilty, even if he didn't know what crime he had committed. This is the core of the trial der process. In the book, Joseph K. is arrested one morning without having done anything wrong. He is never told what the charge is. He spends the entire book navigating a confusing, nightmarish court system, trying to prove his innocence against a law he cannot see. That court system wasn't a fantasy. It was Kafka's childhood home. The judge was his father. The verdict was always guilty. Kafka spent his life trying to please this tyrant. He studied law, which he hated, just to make his father proud. He worked a corporate job he despised. He lived with his parents until he was 31 years old, trapped in the orbit of the man who terrified him. He was a grown man, a brilliant lawyer, and a genius writer, but in his mind, he was always that little boy locked on the balcony, waiting for permission to come back inside. We often picture Kafka as a starving artist living in a garret, but the truth is more depressing. Kafka was a corporate drone. He was a high-functioning insurance executive. From 1908 to 1922, Kafka worked at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute in Prague. His job was to assess industrial accidents. Day after day, he read reports about workers whose fingers were sliced off by sawmills, whose legs were crushed by gears, whose lungs were destroyed by asbestos. He saw how the human body was chewed up by the machinery of the Industrial Revolution, saw how the bureaucracy reduced a human life to a file number and a payout chart. A lost thumb is worth this much. A lost eye is worth that much. This soul-crushing environment bled into his writing. He would work at the office from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., then go home, sleep, eat dinner with his parents in tense silence, and then write from 11 p.m. until the early morning. he lived a double life. In 1912, in a burst of creative fever, he wrote his most famous story, the Metamorphosis die Verwandlung. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. Everyone knows the first sentence. But most people misunderstand the story. They think it's a story about a monster. It's not. It's a story about a burnout. Gregor Samsa is a traveling salesman who hates his job. He supports his parents and his sister. He is the battery that powers the family. When he turns into a bug, his first thought isn't, "Oh my God, I'm a monster." His first thought is, "How am I going to get to work on time?" He's terrified of his boss, not his condition. As the story progresses, the tragedy isn't that Gregor is a bug. The tragedy is that his family stops loving him because he is no longer useful. He becomes a burden. His father, of course, throws an apple at him, which lodges in his back and rots, causing an infection. In the end, Gregor dies alone in his room, dried up and flat. And what does his family do? They are relieved. They take a tram ride into the countryside, happy that the problem is gone. Kafka was writing about his greatest fear, that if he stopped working, if he stopped pretending to be normal, if he revealed his true monstrous artistic self, his family would discard him. He felt like a parasite in his own home. This feeling of alienation extended to his romantic life. Kafka was a handsome man, tall, blue-eyed, well-dressed. Women loved him. But he was terrified of intimacy. He was engaged twice to the same woman, Felice Bauer, and broke it off both times. He wrote her over 500 letters, poured his soul out on paper. But when it came to actually being in the same room, to the physical reality of marriage and sex, he panicked. He famously wrote, "Intercourse is the punishment for the happiness of being together." He viewed his body as a trap. He was a hypochondriac, obsessed with Fletcherizing his food, chewing each bite 40 times. He stood naked in front of open windows to toughen himself. He felt weak, clumsy, and gross. He believed that marriage and children were for strong men like his father. He, the insect, did not deserve to propagate his species. He chose his writing over his happiness. He famously said, "I am made of literature and cannot be anything else." But the body he hated was about to betray him in the cruelest way possible. In 1917, Kafka began to cough up blood. The diagnosis was tuberculosis. For Kafka, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a relief. He almost welcomed the disease. He called it the germ of death, but also saw it as a way out. Finally, he had an excuse to quit the insurance job he hated. Finally, he had an excuse to break off his engagement. The disease was the physical manifestation of his internal suffering. He wrote in his diary, "My head has made an appointment with my lungs behind my back." He spent the last 7 years of his life moving between sanatoriums, trying to breathe. As the disease progressed, it attacked his larynx throat. Eating became agony. Drinking was torture. It is a cruel irony that Kafka, a man who had always had a neurotic relationship with food, was now physically unable to eat. During this time, he wrote one of his final and most heartbreaking stories, A Hunger Artist. The story is about a man who fasts for a living. He sits in a cage for 40 days without eating while crowds watch, but the public loses interest. They move on to other amusements. The hunger artist is left alone in his cage, forgotten in the straw. When the circus overseer asks him why he starves himself, why he never found any food he liked, the hunger artist whispers his final secret, "Because I couldn't find the food I liked. If I had found it, believe me, I should have made no fuss and stuffed myself like you or anyone else." Kafka was the hunger artist. He starved himself of love, of joy, of connection. Not because he was noble, but because he couldn't find a way to digest the world. He couldn't stomach the brutality of his father, the boredom of the office, the noise of modern life. In the spring of 1924, Kafka's condition became critical. He was moved to a clinic near Vienna. He was literally starving to death because his throat had closed up. But even in his final agony, there was a flash of light. In his last year, he met Dora Diomen, a young Jewish woman who ran away from her Orthodox family. For the first time in his life, Kafka moved out of his parents' house. He'd lived with Dora in Berlin. They were poor. It was the height of inflation, but he was happy. For a few brief months, the insect became a man. He found the food he liked, but it was too late. On June 3, 1924, Franz Kafka died. He was 40 years old. He was buried in the New Jewish Cemetery in Prague. His father, the giant Hermann, survived him. The father stands over the son, even in death. The family tombstone lists Hermann Kafka in large bold letters at the top, and Franz Kafka in smaller letters below. Even in the grave, he couldn't escape the shadow. But history has a way of correcting the scales. Hermann Kafka is now forgotten, remembered only as the villain in his son's biography. But Franz is everywhere. Every time you wait on hold with a customer service line for hours, that is Kafka. Every time you fill out a form that makes no sense to get a permit you didn't know you needed, that is Kafka. Every time you feel like you are guilty of something, but you don't know what, that is Kafka. He predicted the 20th century. He predicted the totalitarian states where citizens are arrested at night. He predicted the faceless corporations. He predicted the isolation of the modern individual. He wanted to be burned. He wanted to be forgotten. But Max Brod knew better. He knew that the world needed to see the nightmares of Franz Kafka, so that we would know we are not the only ones having them. In the trial, the priest tells Joseph K., "It is not necessary to accept everything as true. One must only accept it as necessary." Joseph K. replies, a melancholy conclusion, turns lying into a universal principle. Kafka told us the truth about the lies. He showed us that the monster isn't the bug in the bed. The monster is the world that made him feel like one.